Good afternoon, and thank you so much to Dr. Michelle. We met her earlier this year. It's hard to believe. We feel like we've known each other now forever, but she was part of a gathering that we had here at the Woodrow Wilson Center of scholars starting to come together and help us plan the program for the National Women's History Museum. And we had a couple of more meetings with scholars across the country, and it was just wonderful insight. But one of the most wonderful things that came out of this meeting was this series of lectures. It has been such a delight to hear from scholars about various aspects of women's history. And of course, this is the goal of the National Women's History Museum, is to get importance, some important things about women's history, but a lot of ordinary things about women's history out to the general public. We are very honored and pleased to have Meryl Streep as our national spokesperson. So some of you may have seen in the paper, Washington Post today, that she did a photo shoot for Vogue magazine and focused on the museum. And we are just tickled to have her and the notice that she gets bringing attention to women's history. Her favorite story is about Deborah Sampson, the first woman who took a bullet for this country. It was during the Revolutionary War, and she says, you know, we all grew up, we learned about Benedict Arnold, we can tell you who the first traitor is, we can't tell you the name of the first woman to take a bullet for this country. So it's wonderful to have her in our camp, and we are just completely honored and tickled to have Dr. Gordon with us today and to learn more about this fascinating time in our nation's history, but more importantly, the role that women played. Thank you very much.
Before I introduce Linda Gordon, let me just quickly say that the schedule for the spring, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I think 9 lectures lined up. No, that can't be. I'm including the ones that we've already had. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the spring. So please pick up a schedule, put it on your calendar, and tell your friends and students, and please join us for this wonderful series of lectures. This is a kind of a longish introduction, but it's because it takes a long time to talk about all the incredible things that Linda Gordon has done. Linda is someone who very much embodies the dual commitment to both scholarship and public policy that I mentioned that the Wilson Center tries to promote. She's a university professor of the humanities and the Florence Kelley Professor of History at New York University. And those of you who are familiar with U.S. history will know that this is a chair that's very aptly named for its current incumbent. For both Gordon and Kelley, research and activism on behalf of women and their families have been inseparable. Professor Gordon's lecture is part of the series that Joan mentioned, which is co-sponsored by the Wilson Center and the National Women's History Museum. And its aim is to highlight the past, present, and future of U.S. women's history. Professor Gordon's career is and has been central to all 3 of those phases. She's truly one of the founders of the field, someone whose many contributions as an author and editor have built and shaped women's history and have helped it earn the recognition it now enjoys. It's also clear that Linda, along with the dozens, if not hundreds, of fine students that she's trained over the years in her work teaching at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and now at NYU, her students, many of who have gone on to have distinguished careers in their own right, will undoubtedly continue to influence women's history for decades to come. Although Linda Gordon began her professional life as a Russian historian with a doctorate in Russian history from Yale University, her first published book was in U.S. women's history. When Woman's Body, Woman's Right, A Social History of Birth Control in America was published in 1976, women's history was just beginning to gain a foothold. Woman's Body, Woman's Right not only gained immediate acclaim both for Linda and for women's history when it received a nomination for a National Book Award in history, it also marked women's history as a distinctive field, one in which scholars would take on difficult subjects, often unmentionable subjects like birth control, and study them from a perspective that was both intellectually rigorous and politically engaged. That same year, 1976, Professor Gordon also published her pioneering co-edited documentary history, America's Working Women. Again, a breakthrough book because it showed that, contrary to popular belief, women had always been involved in wage earning and in the labor movement. This book was also distinctive in its generosity by presenting a rich collection of primary sources, songs, pictures, pamphlets, and manifestos, as well as more conventional historical documents. It provided primary materials for other scholars and students to use and to set the stage for the wealth of books and articles on working women that were to come. In 1983, Linda Gordon went on to publish her doctoral dissertation, Cossack Rebellion, Social Turmoil in 16th Century Ukraine, a prize winner in Russian history, but very fortunate for women's history, she soon returned to the field of women's history with another path-breaking book, Heroes of Their Own Lives, The Politics and History of Family Violence, which appeared in 1988. Again, she took an unmentionable subject, this time domestic violence, and brought it out into the open, throwing down a marker by demonstrating, in the spirit of the book's wonderful title, Heroes of Their Own Lives, a phrase taken from Dickens, that the people affected by domestic violence, many of them women, many poor, members of racial and ethnic minorities, were not merely passive victims, but often took hold of their own situations, and using whatever means were available, sought to shape their lives actively, to become, in academic terms, agents or subjects. This was an idea that would have tremendous reverberations for the field of women's history, prompting future scholars not to ignore the discrimination and mistreatment of women, but at the same time to uncover and explain the many ways in which women have mobilized singly and collectively to resist their oppression. This dual emphasis on policy and agency reappeared in Professor Gordon's next book, Pitied but Not Entitled, Single Mothers and the Origins of Welfare. Published in 1994 as the debate over welfare reform that resulted in ending welfare as we know it was just getting underway, this was a timely book, but also one that was deeply rooted in historical scholarship. Starting in the 1890s, it traced the two-track system that stigmatized welfare mothers on one hand, while honoring the recipients of Social Security and unemployment on the other. And it showed how that distinction became embedded in the very policy that was now about to be destroyed. It also signaled how the successive policy would continue to discriminate against poor women. Shortly before this, Linda had edited an important collection of essays, Women, the State, and Welfare, which placed American welfare policy in comparative perspective and showed how certain other countries had developed more constructive and positive approaches to the needs of single mothers. Together, these two books inspired many feminists to oppose welfare reform, but the political tide was already turning in another direction, and poor and low-income mothers continue to live with the consequences of the bill that was passed in 1996. Linda, however, did have another opportunity to have a direct role in shaping public policy when she was invited to join an advisory council on violence against women set up by the Departments of Justice and Health and Human Services under the Clinton administration. Having gotten a full first-hand view of public policy making, as well as helping to establish a firm theoretical and empirical foundation for the study of women in social policy, a foundation that many scholars, including myself, would profit greatly by building on, Professor Gordon began to move into other directions, pushing the frontiers of women's and social policy history as she did so. The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction, which appeared in 1999, tells the story of 40 Irish orphans who, in 1904, were escorted from New York City to a remote area of Arizona by a group of nuns who hoped to place them with Catholic families. The chaos and violence that ensued, the Catholic families were Mexican, revealed the explosive racial tensions that existed in the border region at that time. While the book tells a fascinating, if chilling, story, it has a deeper purpose to show how social policy inevitably reflects the racial and ethnic, as well as gender tensions embedded within the larger society. At the same time, this book allowed Professor Gordon to bring her longtime interest in the history of the welfare state into conversation with a trend that was becoming increasingly important in U.S. history, namely transnationalism. It's a conversation that, in my view, has long been needed and can be beneficial to scholars in both fields. Professor Gordon's most recent book, there were several others in between, but I don't want to keep us any longer from our speaker, so I'm not going to talk about them, is Dorothea Lange, A Life Without Limits. I won't say anything more about this since you'll soon be hearing about it from Linda herself, except to note that once again it signals a new direction for a historian without limits, someone whose versatility, energy, and profound commitment to women and women's history have opened up so many possibilities. shown so many different ways of understanding women's experience, and made her one of the leading figures in the discipline. Through her writings and teachings, Linda Gordon has placed an indelible stamp on U.S. women's history. It's hard to imagine its past, present, or future without her. Linda Gordon.
I don't usually get such fulsome introductions.
We don't usually have a chance to introduce someone like you.
I am so pleased to have been asked to do this. I feel that something for the future National Museum of Women's History is just the right place to celebrate Dorothea Lange, who really is one of our American heroes. It's too bad, I have discovered, that while everyone in America knows this photograph, I have never met someone who'd never seen it, yet there are still a lot of people who don't know her name. And that's partly because, for reasons that you'll hear later, most of her photographs were published without her name on them. But I hope that will change. This photograph is about to be the subject of a National Public Radio, their series American Icons. It is absolutely an icon. What I want to do today, partly because I'd like to leave as much time as possible for you to ask questions or make comments, is I'm really going to talk mainly about the photographs I'm showing you. I'm going to give you a little background of her life, not much. But I do have a kind of underlying argument about the photographs. Because of the job she was hired to do by the federal government, which I'll explain later, Dorothea Lange became a photographer of rural people, though she was not herself. She was herself a very urban person. And she came to understand something very, very important about the United States in the 1930s, and that is that the majority of the population at that time were not really full citizens of the United States. And by citizens, I don't mean simply what is the official nationality on your passport if you have one. I mean something more profound about having the rights and duties of a citizen. Basically, almost all people of color were essentially excluded from citizenship, and women were too, white women were too, in a number of ways. And I see this photography that she made as an effort to use the power of the visual to draw people into citizenship, to present all of these often very, very poor farmers and farm workers as people worthy of citizenship. So that's the underlying theme that I want to bring to you. Now, Lange was mainly a West Coast person, but she was actually born in Hoboken, New Jersey. She had a very ordinary middle-class life with some complications, but the really major complication happened when she was 7 years old, when she contracted polio. That was in 1902. She was born in 1895. Polio was a new disease in 1902. There were no remedies whatsoever. Iron lungs did not even exist, so that if the disease spread to your lungs, you would certainly die. There was absolutely nothing that could be done. She was quite lucky in a way. She emerged with a very wizened lower leg and foot on her right leg, and she always limped. When I started this project, I thought to myself, well, that's really a fairly minor disability. I was not very educated or learned about what it means to be disabled, but in terms of what it means to Dorothea, let me just tell you, jump ahead and give you a little anecdote. In the 1950s, when she was teaching photography at the California School of the Art in San Francisco, she had a favorite assignment she'd give to her students, which is, she said, bring me photographs of where you live. And by that, in typical Lange way, she did not mean your apartment. She meant something very profound about where you really are, what's the essence of your being. And so one year, the students asked her to bring in a photograph of where she lived, and this is what she brought. This is a picture of her lower leg and foot. It's called an equine foot by doctors, and she was not able to put the heel down on that foot. That taught me a hugely important lesson about disability, but particularly about Lange, that what I saw as a, quote, minor disability, she saw as a hugely formative period of her life. Before I go on, would it be possible to turn down some of the lights toward the back so that some of these pictures won't, I don't know if that's even possible, but great. That probably makes them stand out more. Good. Okay. Although she grew up in the East Coast, in 1918, she and a girlfriend had this idea, very adventurous, this should give you a sense of a kind of girl she was, that they would travel around the world. And they did that, and they got as far as San Francisco, and all of their money was stolen. For that reason, they never left and got work in San Francisco and stayed there. Lange was not an educated woman. She never went to college. She did not formally study photography much. She had really taught herself photography. But another sign of the kind of forcefulness and charisma that she had is that within a year and a half, she had opened a portrait studio in California that was already becoming the portrait studio favored by San Francisco's rich arts patrons. Her clients, such as this, included, this is one of the members of the Levi Strauss family, one of the most well-to-do families and patrons of the arts in San Francisco. Quite an extraordinary achievement for this newcomer to California. You'll notice the style of this photograph. It's very romantic. It's kind of soft-edged and fuzzy. Photography critics call this style pictorialist, and it was the dominating style in the early 20th century up until more modernist photography began to take on. But Lange really hadn't had much experience with that. She was not a part of the Alfred Stieglitz school in New York. She was really working her way toward a style. Okay. These are two of the portraits that she made later in the 1920s, and I want to talk about them just a little because they illustrate something about her evolving eye and her evolving technique. A lot of portrait studios in those days used painted backdrops. They used kind of fake classical columns. They sometimes draped their subjects in Grecian drapery or got them to dress up, or they had made very kind of frontal pictures and asked people to smile. She's not doing that. She's, as you can see in the bottom photograph, a portrait of a pretty well-known Western writer. She's actually involving her clients in conversation and catching them in a moment of thoughtfulness or repose, or there's something kind of unusual and interesting about this. Even more interesting to me is the girl at the top, a child of one of these rich families that were her patrons. And I don't know if you can tell from this photograph, but this girl is sitting on top of her horse. Confronted with a sullen teenager who doesn't really want to have her photograph taken, but whose mother wants photographs of all the family taken, what does Lange do? She does not wheedle the girl into smiling. She takes the photograph of the girl just exactly as she is. She portrays, if anything, that very adolescent sullenness. And I don't know how the family felt about the photograph, but I think it's an extraordinary photograph that says something about who that girl is, and also something just about adolescence, you might say. A marker of her success is that she soon married a painter by the name of Maynard Dixon. This is him on the left and one of his paintings on the right, who was, at the time, possibly the most acclaimed and high-priced painter in the San Francisco area. He often painted the desert, and he often painted Indians, often in this kind of, if you're familiar with the term Orientalist fashion, in which he's kind of primitivizing the Indians. He sees them as sort of part of the earth and part of the landscape. I think that particular painting might have been called Earth Knower. If it's not that one, it's another one. And he always dressed like this, in cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, always in black. This is another quite amazing thing. This newcomer to San Francisco, this limping small portrait photographer, has hooked the sexiest, most eligible bachelor in San Francisco. Her marriage to Maynard Dixon was not easy. That's what she's going to start doing next. But Dixon was gone often for months at a time on his trips to the desert to paint. He was a womanizer. He was a very erratic and at times explosive guy. And this was not an easy marriage, not only because she not only had to put up with that, but she inherited his daughter from a previous marriage, who had for the last couple of years had her father to herself, and now was absolutely furious at this woman who had come and taken her father away. And incidentally, Maynard Dixon was 20 years older than Lange, and Lange was actually closer to the daughter's age than she was to Dixon's age. Furthermore, as if all that wasn't enough, Lange was not only the only child care person, not only of his stepdaughter, but of their two children together. She was not only the only housekeeper, but she earned the living for the family so that he could paint. By the time the Depression came around, that marriage was unraveling, clearly. In fact, if you'll excuse my language, I think of him as the husband from hell. But just my opinion, she was, in a way, crazy about him. But during the Depression, her clientele dropped off. He couldn't make any money because no one was buying paintings. She started, with the extra time on her hands, walking the streets of San Francisco, which were filled with homeless people, with angry demonstrations, with people at soup kitchens. This is one of the early photographs she made. And I want you to think, if you can, for a moment, look about the composition of this photograph. Now, this is not a photograph she could pose in any way. She has captured a moment in which one man becomes the center of your attention because he's the only one facing the camera, even though we don't see all of his face. And I want to point out, I'm going to try to go backward if I can. This is very tricky machine that is not operating well. I wanted to go back to the first picture you saw because I want you to see that the composition is the same. And that photograph was, in a small way, posed. There's a big controversy about that, which I could address later, but let me just say that she took a whole bunch of pictures of this family grouping, as she often did, many exposures. And at the very end, before the last photograph, she asked those two youngsters to turn their heads away from the camera because she had that portrait artist's compositional sense that she wanted nothing to detract you from that face. And part of this, you might say, genius of Lange, and I do think he was a genius, is understanding, being able to see at a glance the power of that face. This is a woman who is actually a very beautiful woman, despite having a very anxious and lined face, but she just sensed that this woman had a very emotionally communicative face, not in a direct way of crying or weeping, but in a way that was important. Okay, now I'm going to try to catch up to where I was. The problem with this PowerPoint, oh, now I've gone too far. The pictures are very big files, so they take a long time. In the early years of the Depression in San Francisco, she started taking more and more of these local San Francisco pictures, and there was a couple of exhibits of her work, and a very interesting man by the name of Paul Taylor saw these photographs and was extremely impressed, and he hired her for a little job he had for documenting depression problems in San Francisco. He was a professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley, though a very, very unusual professor of economics. His field was agricultural labor, which was by this time overwhelmingly Mexican in California and the Southwest. And Paul Taylor actually interviewed workers rather than just collecting data. He even learned Spanish and became quite fluent in Spanish so that he could talk to these workers, not your average economist's way of proceeding. And he also was very well connected with the Department of Agriculture. He took these photographs and showed them to someone in the Farm Security Administration, which was not yet a part of the Department of Agriculture, but would become that soon. And the guy, Roy Stryker, who was head of this little photography project, saw these pictures and was absolutely stunned and just immediately said, I must hire this person. And so Lange got this offer of a job. The Farm Security Administration, which represented at that time kind of the reform progressive wing in a very conservative Department of Agriculture, the Farm Security Administration had got this little tiny project of assembling a group of photographers to document what the Depression meant in the rural areas. And its purpose was very simply political. Its purpose was to use photography to show the conditions that might build support for Franklin Roosevelt's agricultural policy. It was quite a demanding job for someone like Lange to take on. She was the only woman at the time, and for most of the time. She was also the only parent. She had to be on the road for sometimes months at a time, driving around photographing people. One summer alone, she logged 17,000 miles just driving around California. You have to picture what, if any of you know anything about the San Joaquin Valley or the Imperial Valley, these are places where in the summer it can be 110, 115 degrees. There's no air conditioning. There's no air conditioning in the motels they stay in. She's locking herself in these bathrooms with all the windows and closed, and a black cloth that she carried with her to block out the light in order to develop film in the tub and the sink in the bathroom, getting up at dawn because you just cannot work in the middle of the day. So you start to work at 5 a.m. and then you lay off for a while at 11 and then you go back to work in the evening. She frequently climbed on top of her car. Very important thing to register about her. She may have been disabled, but she was very strong. She could walk for miles and had tremendous stamina. She's also carrying, when she's walking through the fields, if you will notice, this is a very large and heavy camera. She never used a 35 millimeter camera. She used these big cameras with plate film that you have to slide in and out. Whenever she could, she liked to have an assistant because it took long enough to load the film that she always liked to have several cameras so that there was an extra camera already loaded with film ready so she could grab an image immediately if you wanted it. In the process of this work, she and Paul Taylor fell in love, got married, and for the rest of their lives, the remaining 30 years of her life, she died in 1965, they were both a personal and a political partnership. And I think Paul Taylor is a very extraordinary guy, and I wish someone would write his biography, but I do want to, as well as being extraordinary in his own way, I want to say that in contrast to Maynard Dixon, he's the husband from heaven. He adored her. You should read the love letters he wrote to her. They're just, you know, any woman would die to have such love letters written to her. He never felt the least bit threatened. He tried to help her in every way he possibly could, and he basically thought she was a genius. And his role in both in the development of her photography and in her ability to do the photography is very interesting. And I would just like to point out one little paradox, which is that for a time in women's movements, the story of a woman being able to find herself comes about when she becomes economically independent and can earn her own living, etc. Well, with Lange, it's the opposite. It's when she got herself a husband who would support her that allowed her the freedom to do these other things. Lange's assignment was to photograph soil erosion, to photograph the Dust Bowl, to photograph old rundown barns, but very soon she returned to her strength, and I think quite central to understanding her photography is that she was always a portrait photographer, no matter what her assignment was or what her subject was. And what I've done here is I've juxtaposed some photographs from some portraits from her studio days with a portrait of one of the migrant farm workers. And I think you see a number of similar things. One of them is that her portraits are always flattering, or her people are always handsome. And I used to wonder about that. I figured, well, maybe she just skipped over the people who weren't so handsome, but she believed that she could make anyone handsome and that everyone was good looking if she could get them to do what she needed, which was, as she put it, to relax into their natural body language. Now, every photographer, I think, knows that most people, when they stand in front of a camera, stiffen up unless you're a professional actor. But Lange, through her 15 years as a portrait photographer, really had this technique for getting these things to happen. I'll go back to this one and talk about that one next. She conversed with people. She herself learned a little Spanish, and whenever possible, Paul Taylor was with her, and he would talk to people in Spanish. She didn't artificially try to get people to smile, but she also knew that it took time. And one of the things that I think I discovered about her technique is that she deliberately worked even more slowly than she had to. She exaggerated her limp and walked around very slowly, and she usually used a tripod. So she'd set up the tripod here and look through it for a while, and then no, she didn't like that place, and she'd try another angle, and she let the little kids, many of whom had never seen a camera, hold her camera, even though she was always terrified that their grubby fingers or the dust was going to get in the camera. She had a couple of standard conversation openers. She'd ask for a drink of water. People were always extremely, especially these Mexican people, extremely hospitable, and of course they would go, and that would take some time because the source of the water was usually far away, and they'd bring her a cup of water. She would ask, how far is it to the next town? She always avoided what she called union questions, and what she meant by a union question was, how much do they pay you here? Because that would send up all kinds of red flags, make the workers very, very frightened that the foreman was going to find out that they would get in trouble and lose their jobs. She also said once, but I think it was part of her idea all along, that a portrait is a collaboration between a photographer and a subject. And because it's a collaboration, the subject has every right to insist on a flattering picture. She didn't see anything wrong with that, nor did she think that that was not being authentic or documentary. Here's another juxtaposition, and again, you see, she's letting this woman just sit on the floor or lean against the wall, and she ends up with a really very, very interesting portrait. And again, confronted with a girl who's very ambivalent about what's going on. She both didn't want to be photographed, but then she kept getting closer and closer to the camera, Lange writes in the field notes. And I think the hands on her face are sort of symbolic of her ambivalence about being in a photograph. So again, Lange just goes with it and does not try to talk her out of that. And you have a picture of a very good-looking, but also very troubled and probably worn-out kid. This is just another example of the kind of work she can get because of her method in allowing people to just engage in conversation or whatever they're doing. There's another quality about these photographs I think that's important, and that is that these people are at times serious, but they're not downhearted. They rather look, I think, thoughtful. They're kind of contemplative. Seems like maybe he's discussing something serious about what's wrong with the economy and or even what his family consists of. We don't know, but you constantly see people like this woman in the lower left who are pensive and dignified looking. I hate to use the word respect, it's such a cliche, but that is clearly there, just as it is with this guy who I actually think is a Filipino who's working in the lettuce fields, probably near Salinas. When she went to the Southeast photographing sharecroppers, she's using the same kind of portrait style. It's true that she's probably almost certainly asked him to stand up against this tobacco farm. This is a tobacco farmer from North Carolina. Because like, say, Walker Evans, she's really interested in the beautiful textures and hand-builtness of these kind of buildings. But again, this is, as you'll see later when I talk specifically about race, this is very, very different from stereotypical images of African American people that white people might have seen at this time. Again, this person seems, if I can use that term, very citizen-like. She also would sometimes photograph, this is a pose that you might see in a fashion magazine, where the woman is framed by the umbrella that she uses to keep out the sun. Now, she's very interested in the hard work that these people are doing. And that is clearly one of the major themes of her work, is to show that we who eat these foods are dependent on people who are doing this very, very difficult work. And as you see on the upper right, she's very clear about showing us that women are doing this work as well as men. She includes all kinds of things in this work, including what this woman is doing washing the clothes, and her caption to this. And unfortunately, the captions, I can talk about that later, were never published with the photographs. They're entirely separated, so I can't show it to you. But she wanted us to know that this woman is a grandmother who is one of the migrant laborers living in these camps. But to continue in this theme of portraiture, I've begun to think of this photography as what I call visual democracy, because, as I implied at the beginning, I think she is deliberately making photographs that want to, so to speak, pull these people into a sphere that we can think of as the citizenry, as the people who are the building blocks of democracy in our society. The man on the left is someone from an organization that Paul Taylor was very interested in, the Southern Tenants Farmers Union. But this is taken after they got driven out of Arkansas and built a cooperative known as the Delta Cooperative. At the same time, you see, again, just to repeat, this method of engaging people in conversation. And I found the portrait on the right particularly interesting because this guy's lying on the ground. He's laid, taken time off in the heat of the day to lie down in the shade. And she doesn't ask him to get up. She's engaging in a conversation with him while he's lying on the ground. And you still get a sense of a very active kind of participation in the photograph. Now, when Lange Lange was obviously, let me just say, that she was extremely conscious of the problem of racism in the United States. And it actually began with her exposure to the way Mexican-American migrant farm workers were treated, but it developed as she went to the Southeast. And in fact, of the photographs that she made for the Farm Security Administration, 1/3 of them, or more exactly 31%, this was not calculated by me, but by an archivist who went through them, 31% were photographs of people of color. But those photographs were almost never distributed at the time. The way the FSA worked is, and you should know that all of these photographs, which are at the Library of Congress, are in the public domain. They are free for anyone to use them for any purpose whatsoever, and they have sometimes been used for very outrageous purposes. And soon, the Farm Security Administration became well known to journalists as a source of good photographs if you wanted to illustrate anything about farms. And furthermore, I think a very important thing to think about is that as a result of that project, Americans' concept of the Depression is actually more rural than it might otherwise be. If you look in American history textbooks or photographs illustrating the Depression, they're usually rural because there was no comparable project studying the city sufferings of the Depression. But Lange, in her consciousness of race, also tried to make photographs of racism, and that was very difficult. First of all, there were a lot of strictures. There were rules that were imposed on them. You were not allowed to take any pictures of the signs that said white, colored. You were not allowed, although she violated this, but so did all the photographers. They violated it and just kept these pictures for themselves. You were not supposed to take pictures that showed white and black people together. They were very, very concerned not to offend the Southern Democratic Congresspeople on whom Franklin Roosevelt was, of course, completely dependent for his majority. But the other problem is that racism is an abstraction. It is an idea. It is not a person, and it's very hard to illustrate it. This is one of very, very few Lange attempts that I think are successful. And I think it is successful because the spatial relations in the photograph on the picture plane replicate exactly the power relations in the society. This guy is a plantation owner. He's assumed a fairly aggressive posture with his leg up on the bumper of that car. On the very far left, if you look, you see a sliver of Paul Taylor, which she probably cropped out when she actually made prints of this, but I took it, as you see, from the contact sheet. And Paul is helping her by engaging that guy in conversation because he was probably not too happy to be photographed. Behind him are his sharecroppers who are receding into the background, although it's obvious from their glances that they're actually very interested in what is going on. Incidentally, if you saw a real print of this, it would be a much more beautiful picture because she would have worked with it in the darkroom to lighten up areas and make them more visible, but I wanted to use this on purpose. But it's very, very hard to do this, and it's very hard to find the relations that people are in that express something like this. I think, though, that some of her most, you might say, angry photography about race, and she's not usually angry. The tone of her photographs, if you've noticed, is not at all what you'd call angry. But the thing that made her most angry was the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. Just to remind you, we're talking about 120,000 people, 2/3 to 3/5 of them U.S. citizens, not even accused, let alone convicted of any crime, all of whom were rounded up and imprisoned. And Lange was hired to document this in the early part of the evacuation and the internment. And incidentally, I discovered when I was doing this biography that these photographs had never been published. And so I took a sort of short detour in working on the biography to publish a photographic book of just her internment photographs. The book is called Impounded, and it refers not just to the people, but also to the photographs, because the U.S. Army was running this, and they had hired her, but when they saw finally what the photographs were like, they fired her, and they impounded the photographs and would not allow them to be released. At the end of the war, they were placed in the National Archives, but basically hardly anyone knew they were there, so they weren't published. So the title obviously refers both to the photographs and to the people. This is one of these highly symbolic photographs that she can produce from time to time. When people were being evacuated, each person was given a number. The head of a family would be 10235A, and his wife would be 10235B, and his children's would be C, D, and E, and then if there was a grandmother, there should be F. You understand what I'm saying? And they were literally tagged like packages. And this is Lange, I think, telling us in this really beautiful way about a dehumanizing process. She was even willing to sacrifice portraiture and to sacrifice any artiness in the photographs in order just to document the conditions in which people lived. Although, once I get someplace, it's hard to go back. In doing this photography, this is the first time, well, it's the only time that she broke with Franklin Roosevelt, who she adored. She was a passionate New Dealer with a tremendous faith that Roosevelt's policies could really change America. And I want to point out what people may not register is the tremendous importance to her, the fact that Roosevelt was also a polio victim. That was something just full of enormous meaning for her with her own sense of herself. But these are just more of the internment photographs. And again, you see that style of portraiture. These are taken from people mostly before they were in the camps, because in the camps she was not allowed to get that close to people. She really had to take pictures from far away, but it's the same kind of both, if you look at the woman at the bottom, very non-stereotypical view of the Japanese, and also just a very poetic and beautiful view of this grandfather with his son. She continued that, or tried to continue that, in the late 50s and early 60s when she went to Asia with her husband. This is a totally different kind of portraiture, though, that she couldn't really manage because her usual technique wasn't available. She couldn't talk to people. She didn't know their language. As a single woman, she could not walk around alone in the streets of places like Pakistan or Egypt. People are suspicious of her. people are not forthcoming. And so what she does is the same thing I think she did with that sullen girl on the horseback. She photographs that very distance that she has from these people, symbolized here by the man. This is a man with a veil. In the next picture, you'll see women with veils, and also by her very strange, very modernist cropping of that photograph of the boy. This is Egypt, I think. Now, if you were to ask Lange her views about gender and women's role, she would say the most conventional, even conservative things. She said that she definitely thought that women had their destiny was motherhood, and they were uniquely gifted at homemaking, and that was their main calling in life, and so on and so forth. I find it very interesting that I don't think the pictures say the same thing as her words. I'll start with this one because, in fact, unless you look closely, you might not be aware that this is a woman. You might not know she's weighing her cotton, and that a sack of cotton, perhaps you might not think of it that way, but a full sack of cotton can easily weigh 100 pounds. And she is lifting this to hook it onto the weigh station. Lange made, I think hundreds of photographs of people at the weigh stations, because for the migrant farm workers who were paid piece rate, this is a very, very important point, because this is the nexus. I mean, in addition to the very exploitive wages and working conditions, this is another moment of possible exploitation where the foreman could underestimate your weight. And you have to be, and of course, presumably the opposite could happen, and the workers could add weights to give them more. And so there's a great deal of tension in these photographs at the weigh station. This is from a different period. This is a World War II defense plant worker coming home after a long day working in shipbuilding in Richmond, California. This certainly does not look like a woman who thinks that her only destiny is being a mother and taking care of a home. There is, again, this is not at all an unattractive woman, but there is an absolute strength and toughness about this woman that you can see a lot. Lange made many, many Madonnas, women with children. The famous picture at the beginning, Migrant Mother, is a classic Madonna. This is an extraordinary one for a number of reasons. First of all, it could not have been published at the time because you could not publish a picture of a woman breastfeeding. Secondly, I want you to notice this is her home, this lean-to with just a kind of tarp or a piece of canvas on, tied to a tree on one side and with a pole on the other side. She does not exactly look like she's overflowing with milk, but I think there is absolutely no mistaking a completely steely look in her eye about her determination. And Lange, actually, on the far right of the picture, you see her husband, who is lying prone. He's exhausted, and he's according to Lange's notes, he's just very, very seriously depressed. And Lange's impression was that it was this woman who is keeping them going at a time when he is prepared to give up. But consider this Madonna. This woman won't even take her sunglasses off. There are many things you could say about this, but one thing you might say is that there's no way that you would imagine that taking care of a baby is the only work that this woman does. She's dressed for work in the fields. She also made photographs of pregnant women, and those too could not be distributed at the time because pregnant women just weren't supposed to appear in public, and those were the days, and for long afterward, where you wore those big, voluminous dresses that tried to make people not notice that you were pregnant. But again, these women are not exactly filled with joy and looking forward to this wonderful thing that is going to happen to them when they have a child. And of course, it may not have been their only child. I'll just get past this one for now because I want to get to this. I'm looking at the time. She made so many photographs of fathers with their children that one photography critic who helped me a lot with this book, calls them her Padonnas. This is one of the more interesting, they're all interesting. This is one of I think this is interesting in a whole number of ways. First of all, clearly this guy dressed up, okay? Look at his shoes. He did not wear those shoes out in the field. He's done his hair perfectly with that completely straight part, and he obviously looks like he's got very clean clothes on. He's also in a very kind of tough masculine pose, the same pose as the plantation owner, except that he's looking at her. Notice this is where he lives. This is his shack, but there are a number of things to notice about it. Obviously, it's very poor. It's put together of cardboard and other things to the side, but you notice it's very neat. The yard is swept. The boots turned upside down, probably because they've been rinsed out and then put them that way to dry and drain. The utensils, the tub, which is what you would use for bathing, all there, and then there is the small child peeking out the door, unable to get over her curiosity about what's going on. I put these two together, one from, I think again, North Carolina, and one, the guy who would have been called an Okie, so to speak, a Dust Bowl drought refugee having moved west. I put them together because the pose and the emotion is the same. They are these men who have at once a kind of very protective hand on their children, but also a very much pride in this children. And as I often have seen over and over again, I often find these father-child pictures more tender and more loving even than the mother-child pictures. And Lange could also do happy very, very well. I haven't shown you a lot of it, but here's a guy who's just come home from his day in the fields, and his kids and his dog are jumping all over him, very happy to see him. And you see he's just grinning from ear to ear with pleasure at being greeted that way. Lange expressed a lot of emotion through the body, and some of her finest portraits show no faces. On the bottom you have a migrant farm worker whose whole it's very graceful, but at the same time the leaning of that body just expresses his probably exhaustion, his hopelessness. The one at the top is from a Japanese internment camp, and what is interesting about it is that even as a distance you see his kind of depression. Lange was extremely sensitive to the effects both of the depression but also of the internment of the Japanese Americans, to their effects on the male ego. Both of them in a way had a similar effect, because central to masculinity in our country at that time was that you can support your family, that you earn a living for your family. And both the depression and the imprisonment meant that that was impossible. And so men are really suffering from this very humiliating experience, and she noticed it a lot. There are other things in which she uses the body that and you see no faces, that are nevertheless very expressive. The one on the bottom is probably a very famous picture that some of you have seen it, because again it's one of those overtly symbolic pictures, right? The overturned wheelbarrow is the same as the bent-over guy, is the symbol of the economy that's just gone wrong. And here at the top, I, in my mind, for some reason, I think of this as the common man photograph, where you just see these two farm people having a discussion with each other. We don't know what they're talking about, but you just get a sense of the seriousness of what they're debating. She was also, in terms of the body, very, very sensitive to natural grace. And she could pick up a gesture. I think of this woman, it's a very minimalist gesture, but it could almost be like a Javanese dancer, those hands turned up in that way, or the way that the man is leaning into the plow that his mules are pulling. And if you had any doubt that there was a personal meaning about these bodies, you would get over it by looking at her literally scores of photographs of feet. She's using feet on the left just in a fairly, by now cliched way in which the feet stand for the life of hard work, the feet and the completely run down, almost non-existent shoes. But on the right, you see again, she's a tired, exhausted person who probably maybe doesn't even have shoes, but there's an enormous grace in that beautiful foot with that elegant arch that might belong to a dancer. Finally, and this is the last image I'll show, she was also very, very interested in relationships and trying to show people in relation to each other. And I just chose to put together one that's really very happy of someone doing someone's hair while she's holding the baby, and they look like they're just having a very quiet, good time doing that together. And the one on the right, which again is from World War II, where she did a lot of photography. She just titled this argument in a trailer court. She didn't know, of course, we don't know what they're arguing about, but there's absolutely no mistaking the just electric tension between them in their anger. Just in closing, I'll just say briefly, people often ask, where would Lange be today? We have a little evidence of that. For example, shortly before she died in 1963 or 4, when she was already dying of cancer, she got a letter from some photographers who were associated with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, asking her if she would be their sponsor and mentor. They wanted to establish a photographic collective to document the civil rights movement. And she was quite thrilled to get this letter. She was extraordinarily moved by the civil rights movement. She was already too ill and died too soon to really do very much. Another thing that says something about where she would be today, she was very supportive of the early anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. And one of the interesting things about that story is that some of you may know the very famous events at the University of California, Berkeley, where students had their first sit-in in Sproul Plaza, and then Clark Kerr, the chancellor, had the police come and drag them out. Clark Kerr had been Paul Taylor's graduate student, and he even wrote some articles with Paul Taylor. But nevertheless, Paul Taylor and Dorothea Lange were furious at him. They just thought it was absolutely the wrong thing to do. Now, as far as the women's movement, I actually think that Lange might have been quite uncomfortable with some things that the women's movement had to say, some of the more radical statements about getting rid of gender and that men can take care of babies and, all kinds of things. I don't know. She didn't live long enough to know that. But I realized not too long ago, in giving another talk, when someone asked me where would she be today, I immediately said, oh, she'd be with Occupy Wall Street. And I think there are several reasons for that. I think that despite her emphasis on race, that her analysis, which she got from Paul Taylor and was very much the New Deal analysis, was that it was class exploitation and class inequality that were at the root of the nation's problems, the belief that that was the root of the Depression, that that was the root of the subordination of people of color, was their exploitation and not really being able to represent themselves in a democracy. I also think she might contribute to that, that Occupy Wall Street kind of theme, because I could imagine her portraits of some of the people there that they might have been very revealing. But, and this is a big but, I think it's wrong to exaggerate too much Lange as a political person, even though that's what I did in this lecture because it's what I chose to talk about. But because Lange was first and foremost a photographic artist, and that's what she mostly cared about. She lived and breathed photography, and she did a lot of photography after this this New Deal period. But I think one way that you can bring the two together, the politics and the art, is that her biggest hostility in photography were images that she thought were cliches. She said once, there's no point in showing someone a photograph if they've basically seen it before. You always want to show them something they'd never seen before. You want to, and the way I would put it is that she thought that photography should ask questions rather than providing answers. And I think that in the portraiture, one of the things you see is that ultimately these people are a little bit unknowable. They are interesting precisely because you never imagine that you know all about them. They have the dignity of being people that you expect have complicated inner lives that you might find out a little more about if you could talk to them. But they're never stereotypes. They're always individuals. So I'll just stop there, and I'd love to hear anything that you have to say. Sure. Questions or comments or anything? Yeah, please.
Did she leave notes that explain sort of, since she talked to the people she was speaking, what kinds of conversations they had or how she got them?
They're fragmentary, but they exist. She learned this from Paul Taylor, a little tiny notebook that she could put in a pocket. He always carried it in his pocket, the pocket of his shirt. And she had a small one like that. And there's lots of them. They're all in the Oakland Museum. They are not systematic, unlike the captions. And some days she would make a lot, and other days she wouldn't. And sometimes you can't know which photographs these notes go to. But among the things she did that is very interesting, which I used a lot, is she took down people's actual words. Her assistants would say that she would talk to somebody and make some photographs, and then she would run back to her car and sit there and she would write down what she remembered them saying. And so she does have a lot of stuff. I mean, obviously I can't prove that she got it right, but that is clearly in the language of the people she interviewed. But the main thing she did systematically for the Farm Security Administration is that every photograph has a caption, and her captions were not interpretive, they were factual. And that would be part of the conversation. She would say, well, these people came from Enid, Oklahoma, and this is a second marriage for both of them, and they have 2 children and 4 stepchildren, and last year they worked mainly in Idaho potatoes, but this year they're trying to go further south, and they would, it's very, very detailed kind of family history. And she was furious that nobody would publish the captions along with the pictures because she didn't want these people to be anonymous. She wanted them to have a specific story in the way that every real person has their own unique story.
Can you either sit down or speak into the mic?
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, please, go.
Often today...
Wait for the mic, Joan.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Often today, photographers will take 50, 100 pictures to get one that we see like this. How many would she take?
It depends, but lots. Of the famous migrant mother thing, we know that there were 7, but we don't know how many she threw away. And she did throw away a lot. she, with the Farm Security Administration, one of the things that drove all the photographers crazy is that they were expected, as soon as they had done their pictures, to ship the negatives off to Washington. And that is very difficult and then Washington would, in its darkroom, in its labs, would make work prints and would send them back to the photographers. But that took a while, and sometimes there were like a month before you saw the pictures, and that's very tough for a photographer because they want to know right away what they were doing wrong, what might make it better. Another thing to remember, there were no light meters in those days, so it was a lot of guesswork about things. And I know that she threw away a lot of stuff of her later work that she owned, and I also know that she cheated and kept some photographs for herself, but she could never use them, because if she had given them to someone to publish them or to exhibit them, then it would have been obvious that she had taken a photograph that theoretically belonged to the federal government. Yeah, right here.
Two quick questions. Could you tell us a little bit more about the migrant mother herself? And secondly, she had children. What was her relationship to them, and are they still alive?
The migrant mother's name is Florence Thompson, and unbeknownst to everyone at the time, and I find this very interesting, she was a Cherokee Indian, and she said later that she was a, quote, full-blooded Cherokee Indian. I find it interesting because this was, in a certain way, the image that people had of a sort of white Dust Bowl victim. Lange didn't know that. She had a lot of children. There was a son and a father who were with them this was taken in Nipomo, which is on the ocean side of California, not in the Central Valley. But they had gone to try to get parts for their car was broken down. There was also a teenager who was there with them, and she appears in some of the earlier pictures, but she just wanted nothing to do with this photographer, and so Lange just sort of said, the hell with her, let her do what she didn't try to get her into the photograph. We know about her from later in her life. She did settle down in California. She never really became other than quite poor. She cleaned houses for a living after she quit farm work. Several of her children did make it more into the sort of established working class or lower middle class of that area. Mm-hmm. Oh, Dorothea Lange's children. Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, she eventually had 6 because she had 4 stepchildren, because Paul Taylor brought 3 children to the marriage. And, he was a nice and supportive husband, but he also assumed that the children were her responsibility. And so she was the main parent for all these 6 children. And in my book, I talk at length. I just can't get into it now because it's very fraught, the whole issue of what she did for childcare with the children while she was working, traveling. Of those children, one of them, 2 of them had died before I started. One of them, her 2 sons were both alive, and I spent a lot of time with them. They were all very, very generous and very judicious. They have a lot of criticisms of their mother. They also think she's a genius. They were very generous toward me, never tried to influence what I would write. They are probably, if they're disappointed, I know some of their disappointments are just things I didn't have room to put in, because everybody has their own favorite anecdotes that they think are the most revealing. But there's a huge family, because all of those children had children, and so there's a whole lot of grandchildren, and they all mainly live still in the Bay Area. And some of the grandchildren who are my generation have been really helpful, and some of them have become friends, actually, from just spending so much time out there with them. But they're really very close as a family, and also Lange's best friend is another very great photographer by the name of Imogen Cunningham. And the Imogen's family and Lange's family were essentially fused, and they became, I think, what anthropologists call fictive kin, but they were really, they might as, I mean, so some of Imogen's children were more or less like Lange's children. They celebrated every holiday together and so on. So there are all those people who are part of this big extended family. Yeah, Eric.
Two questions related to politics. The first has to do with Lange's support for Roosevelt. Could you say a little bit more about that? If she's traveling rural America, looking at the impact of the Depression on rural Americans, FDR's policies didn't exactly uplift them. It, in some cases, did the opposite to them. And the second question about politics has to do with what you call where would Lange be today? And I'm just curious about just that, even that concept. The distance between 1965, I think that's when you said she died, and the present is many decades. And does one just transport her across that time? If she had lived through that period, presumably her views might have changed.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the difference or the distance between class inequality and the Great Depression, and placing her in the context of Occupy Wall Street, that's a big jump. And I wonder how you would make it.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Well, the answer to the first question is, as I mentioned before, Paul Taylor was a person who represented the left side of the Department of Agriculture, and his closest friends were actually all purged from the Department of Agriculture at a very great political thing that happened to the people who were followers of people like Rexford Tugwell. He was totally critical of Agriculture Department policy. I think that their attitude toward Roosevelt was a little bit like, well, I'd say it had two ingredients. One was a little bit like, you know, the king is a good man, but his advisors are terrible. You know, that old traditional thing that Roosevelt really meant well, but he's hemmed in by all the politics and so on. But Taylor said, you know, absolutely, in no uncertain terms, the Department of Agriculture represents, as it still represents, the great corporate growers. It doesn't represent people who actually do the farm work. He said once, maybe it wasn't him, somebody said, you know, the Department of Agriculture knows exactly how many pigs there are in America and has no idea how many farm workers there are. But the other part of it is that Taylor, even more than Lange, was a guy who was committed to, as you would say, working from within, working within the channels of the Democratic Party to make things better. Lange was different. She's not a joiner. She never joined a political organization. I don't even know if she ever signed a petition. I don't know. She just wasn't an organization woman, but she was actually, in some kind of more spiritual way, I'd say more radical. When she went with him to Asia, where he was working for USAID, trying to push land reform in Asia, you know, he'd failed at land reform in the United States, which is what he'd been about, so he tried to do it in Asia, failed there too, and she thought it wasn't even worth trying because she could see with her own eyes that basically the governments that he was working for were governments of right-wing dictators who were completely in the pocket of the really feudal landowners in a lot of those countries. But as to the jump to OWS, I mean, of course, it's a completely ahistorical question, and I know that, but I don't think it's such a leap at all, because I think that Lange had a very strong belief in what I would call, what historians call Republican citizenship, small r, meaning participation, that citizenship isn't just about going to the polls once every 4 years in the liberal sense, but it's really about being able to actually participate at some level in the policies of your country. And I think that she for that reason, liked the parts of the New Left that she saw that were very much about participatory democracy was, after all, the slogan of the U.S. And of course, it's now. I don't know if probably everybody's heard about and I don't know if it's true elsewhere, but in New York, there's all this mic check business, and because they don't allow microphones, and so everybody is repeating the words, and it's all about individual creativity. And I think she would just temperamentally like that. Plus, they were both, in a certain sense, Lange and Taylor, left populists, in the sense that they thought that the big guys control the government, and that has to change. And since the politics of Occupy Wall Street are just that vague, I think she would, but it's an ahistorical statement. I admit it, I wouldn't write it. But the woman right next to you, I think, had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you could say something about how her work was received in the world of professional photography.
Oh, really good question. The first important thing to know about how it was received is that she didn't live in New York. New York was really the center of art photography. And I think it was great for her that she didn't live in New York, because Alfred Stieglitz started out ruling, he sort of became the new academy that dominated what counted as art photography. Now, she did have a circle of photographer friends in California who were very varied. Her closest friend, besides Imogen Cunningham, was Ansel Adams, who was doing something completely different. But let me also point out that at that time, not a lot of people would call Ansel Adams photography art either, because it was landscapes. It took a while for people to understand the mastery of he was like the darkroom genius and so on. But on the other hand, she also had both Imogen and, say, Edward Weston, who were very modernist. Imogen Cunningham is a much more radical photographer. Lange's photography is very, very conservative in its composition, its iconography, very Christian, I think, although she wasn't a religious woman. And so I think and also, let me just say that at that time, people did not accept the idea that you could make documentary photography that was art. They thought what she was doing was propaganda. And she thought that too for a long time, and she also thought, well, art is what my husband does. He does painting. That's art. I'm just a craftsperson. I think it was very slow, that she went through a very slow process of beginning to conceive of herself as an artist. And I think that went along with how she was received by others. But I think it was happening so that I don't think serious art photographers didn't pay much attention to FSA photography in the 1930s. But, for example, Lange was one of the founding members of Aperture, the magazine that became the art photography magazine, just as she was also one of the founding members, although never in a hands-on way, of Magnum, the first really important agency of photographers, although Magnum was mainly about photojournalists. But what really, I think it changed only very gradually until just after she died. She had the first ever one-woman photography show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1966. She lived long enough to prepare it, and she spent at least a year and a half, very weak, but making every choice. And as was very characteristic of her, it was also more like photo essays. She was caring very much which photograph was next to which and what arrangements they were. But I think that changed her reputation. But you really see how politics affects it, because during the Cold War period, during the McCarthy period, when, abstract expressionism in painting and a kind of ironic picture Robert Frank or Diane Arbus, if you know photography. People were making very ironic and often bitter statements in their photography, and that was what was fashionable. I think people lost interest in her, and it was only with, again, the movements, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the new labor movements of the 1950s and 60s that people rediscovered her work.
This is just a quick question. I've seen very few photographs of Dorothea Lange herself, and this seems unusual. I mean, I think a lot of people probably think that Madonna iconography is Dorothea Lange.
That's true. It is true. A lot of people think that. That question gets to something really important about Lange. She is the only great photographer that I have ever found who never made a self-portrait. The only self-portrait she ever made were pictures. That was that picture of her foot. And she was asked about that. She said, well, I'm just not really very interested in myself. She was actually a very good-looking woman. She's not a raving beauty, but really striking. There's one beautiful portrait I could show you that Edward Weston made of her. And there are some lovely snapshots that her various husbands made of her. But it's quite striking that, I mean, I wouldn't say that she was not introspective, but somehow it just wasn't what she was so interested in other people and what was going on in the world outside her that is what always drew her. But it's really interesting. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for bringing us these wonderful pictures and for bringing us these wonderful insights into which really